Welcome, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the first of a series of events that we're doing. They're RefMig events, and we're calling them Meet the Author. We have invited a series of authors to discuss recent work with us, in this case, a recent wonderful book. And we've chosen them because they speak directly to the themes of the RefMig project. In particular, in this case, themes around why and how refugees are recognized or indeed not recognized by states. So it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. It's Professor Lamis Abdelaaty. She is an assistant professor of political science at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. And she's here to discuss her book called Discrimination and Delegation, Explaining State Responses to Refugees, which recently appeared with Oxford University Press. It draws on her PhD dissertation in political science from Princeton, which also won the Best Dissertation Award from the Migration and Citizenship section of the American Political Science Association. And the research for the book was supported by the National Science Foundation in the US. So evidently we like the book a lot, Lamis, and we're really looking forward to having this conversation with you. I'm joined by my RefMig colleague, Dr. Derya Ozkul, who's a political scientist who's been working with me on questions of refugee recognition in Lebanon and Turkey. Your book looks at practices globally, but also includes case studies of Kenya, of Egypt, and of Turkey. So we're super interested to hear. So perhaps first of all, you would like to tell us just about the book and the thesis that it puts forward, and then we'll have a discussion after that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Catherine, for that wonderful introduction. So the book, as you mentioned, is called Discrimination and Delegation, Explaining State Responses to Refugees. So as you can tell from the title, the central question for the book is what explains state responses to the refugees they receive? The book begins by identifying two puzzling patterns. First, states open their borders to some refugees while blocking others. I call this the discrimination puzzle. And second, there are a number of countries around the world who have given the United Nations control of asylum procedures and refugee camps on their territory. I call this the delegation puzzle. To explain the selective exercise of sovereignty, the book develops a two-part theoretical framework in which policymakers weigh relations with refugee-sending countries and domestic concerns related to ethnic identity. Internationally, the book argues leaders have incentives to use refugees in order to reassure allies and exert pressure on rivals. Domestically, policymakers have incentives to favor those refugee groups with whom they share a refugee identity, an ethnic identity, excuse me. When these international and domestic incentives conflict and push in opposite directions, shifting responsibility to the United Nations allows policymakers to placate both refugee-sending countries and domestic constituencies. The book then carries out what I call a three-stage multi-level research design, which includes statistical analysis of data on asylum admissions worldwide. It includes country case studies of Egypt and Turkey, and it includes content analysis of parliamentary debates in Kenya. The book as a whole argues that studying these questions related to state responses to refugees is really instructive because it helps explain why states sometimes assert and at other times cede their sovereignty in the face of refugee rights. I'll stop there, and I'm sure your questions are going to spur me to get into more detail about the book.
Great. Thank you so much. I mean, as you've presented it, of course, it's a wonderful thesis. And, this is the kind of political science of which I'm such an admirer as somebody who is a legal scholar in terms of just the crispness of the thesis, the clarity of the why questions, and then the crispness and the clarity of the answers. So I'd really like to know a bit more about how you came to the questions. I mean, because for me, hitting on a good research question is a massive part of research.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. So it really started when I was in graduate school and I was reading a well-known article by Salahian and Gleditsch, a 2006 article called Refugees and the Spread of Civil War. And that article makes the argument that refugee movements can cause regional diffusion in civil conflict because as refugees cross borders, they bring with them resources, they bring with them potential rebel recruits, and they bring with them ideas that may result in the spread of conflict. And as I was reading this article, the question that occurred to me was, well, if there are such negative externalities to admitting refugees, why do countries ever admit refugees? Of course, that in and of itself wouldn't have been a suitable question for the project, because I needed to find sort of a variation angle. And we know that in the United States, the canonical example is the so-called Haitian-Cuban paradox, where historically the United States has been much more welcoming of Cuban refugees than it has of Haitians. Of course, this is not unique to the United States. We know from published research that, for example, India has tended to treat Tibetan refugees better than Sri Lankan and Bangladeshis. We know that Costa Rica historically has tended to treat Nicaraguan refugees better than Salvadoran refugees. And so this differential treatment between refugee groups is what sort of led me to the first question, this first puzzle of why do countries welcome some refugee groups and treat others poorly? Then, I was presenting my research at one point in a seminar at Princeton University where I did my PhD work, and I was talking about the fact that there are a number of countries around the world where refugee status determination, the process that determines whether an applicant for asylum will be recognized as a refugee and get access to all the rights that entails, that process in a number of countries is conducted jointly by the government of a country and by the UN Refugee Agency. So in 2011, there were 23 countries where if you applied for asylum, your application would be looked at jointly by the government of that country and the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. There were even more countries, 54 countries in 2011, where if you applied for asylum, your application would be adjudicated solely by the UN Refugee Agency. And these include countries that we think of as generally being very protective of their sovereignty, countries like China, India, Saudi Arabia. These countries also certainly have the resources to conduct this process on their own if they wanted to. And so one audience member at this presentation posed the question of, well, why would countries outsource their asylum policy to the United Nations in this way? And I'm glad that faculty person raised that question, because it became sort of it completed really the puzzle for my book. So that I'm not only looking at why countries treat refugees well or poorly, but also when do they outsource asylum policy to the United Nations as opposed to keeping it in their own grip.
Mm. Yeah, I'm really glad you got that second question, because for me, it's a genuine puzzle, and it has never been even properly studied as this practice. And I should say, when we started to study this, our mutual friend, Professor Rebecca Hamlin, had said, you must read Lamis's doctorate, because she's trying to understand the why of this delegation. And which, because it happens in some African states, in refugee studies, there had been a very lazy explanation about lack of state capacity. But if you looked at the variety of states in question, that's clearly not what's going on at all. And because you asked the two questions, your thesis, if you like, uses both to explain what's going on. I don't know if you can briefly, in a nugget, explain the argument to us, or...
Absolutely. So I argue that the answer to these questions has to do with the fact that states' approaches to refugees are shaped by foreign policy and ethnic politics. And my argument is that it's almost similar to a two-level game, if you're familiar with that framework, that at the international level, government policymakers in a refugee receiving country are concerned with the relations with the refugee sending country. And if the bilateral relations between the country that's receiving the refugees and the country those refugees are coming from, if those relations are hostile, I expect to see an inclusive response for multiple reasons, because admitting large numbers of refugees could destabilize that rival by encouraging mass flight, because admitting refugees could discredit that sending government by saying that people are voting with their feet, or because you could harbor opposition to that sending government that could engage in cross-border attacks. So that's happening at the international level. Now, at the domestic level, I argue that policymakers in the refugee receiving country are thinking about the extent to which they share an identity with those refugees. and I use the term ethnicity very, very broadly to capture whatever cleavages are most salient in any given society. They may be racial, linguistic, religious, whatever. If refugees and policymakers in the receiving country share an identity, I expect to see inclusive treatment. And from the perspective of policymakers in the refugee receiving country, admitting refugees who share your ethnic identity is a way to pander to your constituency. In general, we know that people tend to sympathize more with refugees that they share some sort of identity with. It may also be in multi-ethnic societies. Admitting refugees who share your ethnic identity as a policymaker could be a way to improve or preserve the ethnic balance in your favor. And it can also encourage mobilization along ethnic lines domestically in ways that may electorally or otherwise benefit policymakers. Now, there are going to be some cases where these two sets of incentives, the international incentives that have to do with bilateral relations and the domestic incentives that have to do with identity, they may point in the same direction. So if refugees are coming from a rival country and they share your identity as a policymaker, it makes sense to just let them in. They're coming from a friendly country and they don't share your identity, you may shut them out. There may be cases where these incentives point in opposite directions. And I argue that that's when we're going to see delegation of asylum policy to the United Nations, because outsourcing asylum policies to the UN is a way for policymakers to avoid antagonizing refugee sending countries or their domestic constituencies. It's a way to have someone else take responsibility for politically sensitive decisions. And I talk in the book about the various ways in which the UNHCR is sort of perfect for this role. It's insulated from lobbying. It appears neutral to domestic and international audiences, but at the same time, it is very limited in terms of its staff and in terms of its funding. And it's very easy for policymakers to punish the United Nations Refugee Agency if it were to overstep. And there are probably cases where the UNHCR even self-censors because it knows that it cannot operate on any country's territory without its consent. I know that was sort of a lot of information there. So to perhaps summarize the argument a little bit, this is what it looks like in table form. So as you can see on the top left-hand side, when refugees are coming from a hostile sending country and they are co-ethnics, I expect to see an inclusive asylum policy. When they are coming from a friendly sending country and there's no ethnic tie, that's the cell on the bottom right-hand corner, and I expect to see a restrictive asylum policy. And then on the cross diagonal there, you can see situations where incentives point in opposite directions. Refugees may be co-ethnics, and so you would want to admit them, but they're coming from a friendly country, and that's an incentive to keep them out. And so that's a situation in which I predict governments would want to outsource asylum policy to the UNHCR. And then we have a similar situation in the cell on the bottom left-hand side, where conflicting incentives there also result in delegation.
Great. I mean, this explanation has such a lot of power to it. And of course, you test it a lot. I mean, that's why it's a doctoral thesis from Stanford. So you have a global
Princeton, sorry.
And so you have a global data set and you've done a lot of regressions, but I really enjoyed that on the page, you demonstrate how you're ruling out alternative explanations. And I suppose from my point of view, obviously with all the lawyers' biases, I was surprised that I don't know if you explicitly ruled it out, but it seems to me your thesis suggests that international law doesn't make much difference, whether a state has ratified the Refugee Convention or not, or whether it domestically adheres to the rule of law or not, indices about whether the state is rule of law adherent or on an authoritarian or less authoritarian spectrum. So those explanations don't seem to speak to your thesis. Is that fair?
I think that is fair to an extent. I mean, I think the reason international law doesn't play a lot of role in this explanation is because you can't explain variation with a constant. So, for example, Egypt has ratified the 1951 Refugee Convention. Therefore, its ratification of that convention cannot explain why Egypt treats different refugee groups differently, right? But I should note that international law may well play a role in terms of setting some minimum standard for treatment across all of the cases that I'm looking at. So, for example, perhaps if it weren't for the norm of non-refoulement, Turkey would have historically treated Iraqi Kurdish refugees much worse than they did, right? So we do certainly see situations where governments do return refugees to their home countries, but they don't tend to admit that they're refouling refugees, right? So I certainly think international law plays a role in refugee treatment, broadly speaking, although it may not help us necessarily explain the specific question that I'm looking at, which is variation in treatment across refugee groups. With regards to the rule of law, that's not something that I look at directly, but the cases that I select do contain some variation on this. So for example, I'm looking at Egypt, Turkey, and Kenya, and these are countries that have very different regime types, and they have different trajectories over the time period that I'm looking at. And yet, despite these differences, we do tend to see the same mechanism applying across all of them. I've observed through this research that policymakers can be very savvy. So for example, Turkey has historically refused to designate certain populations as asylum seekers or refugees, like the Bosnians and the Kosovars in the 1990s. And that allows policymakers in a country like Turkey to almost opt in and out of what might otherwise appear to be generally applicable national level policies.
Yeah, great. Derya, did you want to come in now with some more specific questions?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just on that point, perhaps, obviously you're looking at Turkey, Kenya, and Egypt. How did you come up with these cases? This is a question also we are thinking about a lot in our research, how to do the case selection right. And in your case, how did you select these three countries?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So obviously, I did want to select countries where I would be able to do research. And so, being someone who speaks Arabic and Swahili, the choice of Egypt and Kenya made sense. And also, just to be honest, these were also countries that I was just genuinely interested in and wanted to explore. But the selection of the three countries makes a lot of sense for a project like this for a number of reasons. First of all, I wanted to make sure that I selected countries from the global south, because most of the literature on this question of refugee treatment has tended to focus on Western countries. And we know that's not where most of the world's refugees reside, right? We know that 85% of the world's refugees live in developing countries. And so I wanted to really focus on the global south for this book. My selection of Egypt, Turkey, and Kenya allows me to get at the questions that I'm interested in a number of different ways. And let me actually put up a slide that I think can help me sort of go through some of my thinking here. So the three countries differ from each other in a number of ways, right? For example, they have different histories in terms of their refugee policies. So to give just one example, Egypt has never really adopted refugee camps. Turkey has adopted camps, but only for some of the refugee groups on its territory, right? So historically, Iraqi Kurds, for example, more recently Syrians, but not for other refugee groups. And Kenya, of course, has had a very, very firm encampment policy for at least 2 decades now. So these three countries vary in terms of their responses to refugees. And they also vary in terms of their domestic conditions. So I talked a little bit previously about how they have different regime types. They also vary in terms of their economic conditions and so on. And so given all of the differences between these three countries, if I'm looking at all three of them and I see that my explanation holds in all three, that gives me a little confidence that it may hold elsewhere as well, since it does hold for these three very disparate contexts. Another reason why this case selection, I think, is helpful is that there are three different types of cases. Egypt, I talk about in the book, we can think of as a typical refugee recipient in the sense that it has a relatively low number of refugees per capita, and it is a signatory to the Refugee Convention. Turkey is more of an outlier because it's a country that has historically experienced multiple mass refugee influxes, and it has what's called a geographic limitation to the Refugee Convention, whereby it only recognizes Europeans as refugees as a matter of policy and law. Kenya, I argue, is a crucial case in the field of refugee studies because it, has one of the largest refugee camps in the world, and it is the site of an important protracted refugee situation, that of the Somalis. So these three cases, again, are different types of cases. And at the same time, there are some refugee groups that are shared across these cases. So for example, we have Sudanese refugees in both Egypt and Kenya. We have Iraqi refugees in both Egypt and Turkey. And so one of the things that I'm able to do is not just look at how a single country treats different refugee groups, but also, as it were, hold a single refugee group constant and see how that single refugee group is treated across countries. So for example, how Somalis are treated in Egypt versus in Kenya.
Yeah, excellent. So, obviously Turkey is now the largest refugee hosting country because of Syrians, although Turkey doesn't define them as refugees. But so I guess your analysis states doesn't look at Syrians, and why? Is there any reason not including that in the book? Or
that's a very good question. So the reason I don't include Syrians in the book is because my field research was completed prior to the Syrian refugee crisis, and I'm kind of glad that it was completed prior to the Syrian refugee crisis. But I also argue in the book that this kind of retrospective analysis is important, right? Everyone is now focused on the Syrian refugee crisis, and this is not to say that Syrians don't deserve attention. Of course, that crisis deserves attention, but we should not forget that refugees who were displaced in previous crises remain displaced. There continue to be Iraqis displaced throughout the Middle East. There continue to be Somalis who are displaced. So studying these previous movements of refugees is still relevant because those populations remain displaced. And also looking at sort of this more retrospective analysis allows us to understand some of the factors and patterns that continue to influence asylum policy in these countries, even today, and with the Syrians. I haven't looked at, I haven't conducted as thorough an analysis with regards to responses to Syrian refugees. But from looking at secondary sources, it does seem that my framework does apply to Syrian refugees. So just very briefly, we know, for example, that in Egypt, Syrian refugees under President Mohamed Morsi were welcomed into the country. There was no visa that was required. They had access to education and healthcare. Under current President Sisi, there is a security clearance required for Syrian refugees. They're subject to detention and deportation. And that's consistent with a shift in foreign policy orientation in Egypt from supporting the Syrian opposition to supporting Assad's regime. Similarly, in Turkey, we know that Turkey, admitted millions of Syrian refugees, permitted them to reside outside camps, and really limited UNHCR's involvement with Syrian refugees. And that's consistent with the AKP's anti-Assad stance and its sense of solidarity and affinity with Sunni Muslim Syrians. So even though I haven't conducted a thorough analysis of responses to Syrian refugees, I think secondary sources lead me to believe that my framework would still explain Egypt and Turkey's responses to those refugees.
Excellent. Just actually on that point, I have a question on, I guess, how you define ethnic identity in general, because there is obviously a big difference between how, especially in terms of the local population's perception, how the local population perceive ethnic identity is if it's from a linguistically same background. For instance, Turks being more similar, more welcoming towards populations that speak Turkic languages, as we've seen before. Whereas with the religious identity, it's different. And that, I guess, that identity also has changes in time as well, and how the state emphasizes that identity changes in time. So for a long time, in the case of Turkey, they emphasize more on speaking Turkish and being from the Turkish ethnic origin, whereas now this new administration is emphasizing more on being Muslim, and we are all Muslim brothers. But that doesn't say that local population agrees with that, perhaps. So there can be disagreements, as we've seen in Turkey as well, that although the government was trying to emphasize on being Muslim, local population still didn't want to have a group from an Arab origin. So I just wonder how you define ethnic identity in general, and how to perhaps how we can factor in that change in terms of the state's emphasis on whether on ethnic or religious identity. Of course.
So I absolutely agree with your comments. The way that I deal with ethnicity is, again, I'm using the term in the way that many comparative political scientists use it, which is as this umbrella term that captures whatever cleavages are most relevant in a given society. And as I said previously, these can be linguistic or racial or religious or tribal, what have you, right? That leaves open the possibility that the relevant ethnic identity could change over time. And my argument really is about policymakers and who they perceive as being their ethnic kin, right? And so it's entirely possible that the relevant ethnicity is going to change because there's been a regime change. And so the new policymakers have a different ethnic identity, or things could change over time, just as, you know, ideas or orientations change about who is worthy of solidarity, or who, who people might consider to be similar to them. So in the case of Turkey and the AKP, as I said, again, I haven't done sort of, primary research myself on this question. I'm mainly relying on secondary research here because this aspect is not in my book. But it does seem that from the perspective of policymakers in Turkey, right, that they perceived Sunni Muslim Syrians to be their ethnic kin. And then you're right, they kind of embarked on this PR campaign to try to get the Turkish population to sort of go along with them.
Yeah, exactly. And perhaps here the rule of law becomes important as well. If the state is becoming more authoritarian, perhaps they may push more on local population to make them accept their own preferred ethnic or religious group that they wish. Yeah, okay.
That's certainly possible.
Yeah. Just maybe my last question, Cathryn, I'm sure you have more. So I guess at the time, just very recently, actually, both Turkey and Kenya took over RSD from UNHCR. And we see this kind of increasing trend from RSD being handed over from UNHCR to states. How can we explain this, you think? Or how can we think
right.
about it?
So again, since these developments are relatively recent, they're not really in my book, and I haven't studied them closely. But my argument would suggest that something must have changed, right? Either bilateral relations have changed, or perceived affinity with refugees has changed. In the case of Turkey, at least, it does make sense to me that Turkey would want to take back the RSD function from UNHCR, given that it is now host to this very large population of Syrian refugees. Syrian refugees in Turkey constitute the majority of refugees. And Turkey, from day one, refused to have UNHCR involvement with the Syrians. I remember I was actually doing interviews, At one point, I met Alexander Alenikov, who was the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, and I asked him about this. We were having a conversation about the fact that UNHCR staff in Turkey were unable to gain access to the camps where Syrian refugees were being housed. So the fact that Turkey has shut UNHCR out from dealing with Syrian refugees, and the fact that Turkey is now taking over RSD, given that Syrians constitute the largest refugee population there, I think aligns with the international and domestic story that we were just talking about, right? But as I said, I've not done the type of close analysis that's necessary to answer this question fully, and it is very recent, so we don't have access to the kind of archival or insider info that would really help us analyze it.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for answering those questions so well. And you're right, we're pushing you into domains that aren't actually in the book, but we're really asking you to defend your theses from different directions. And because we've been studying handovers, they're really on our mind. Just why the to and fro over time from states to UNHCRs is also, again, that it's not been studied. So it seems to be full of interesting questions for lawyers and political scientists to answer. So do you see this as a book that, where do you see it as making a contribution to maybe political science generally? And then if we think out there in the sort of policy world, where do you what do you see the implications of this thesis for policymakers?
Right. So I think there are a number of different contributions to political science and implications for policy. So in terms of contributions to political science, these questions of why governments treat refugees well or poorly, and why refugees might be delegated to the UNHCR, they're really puzzling questions, but they're really understudied in political science. So I think my book, allows me to add insights to the literature on the politics of migration and asylum, and also the literature on political responses to globalization as, human movements, human cross-border movements increase over time, and also to the literature on international human rights, because part of the way that I frame my book is on this question of refugee rights and the ways in which states may assert or cede their sovereignty with regards to refugee rights. In terms of implication for policy, I think my book suggests that the United Nations and NGOs need to be a little more courageous in terms of targeting their advocacy and assistance towards particular refugee groups, because there are going to be certain refugee groups that are going to be treated restrictively by countries. And we should sort of let go of the myth that countries have one blanket asylum policy. Many people tend to describe countries with sort of a one-word adjective, saying that country has a generous asylum policy, that country has a restrictive asylum policy. But my book really suggests that there's variation across refugee groups, that countries are making decisions with regards to each refugee group. And one group may be treated well, another may be treated poorly, and the third might be outsourced to the UNHCR. So we need to pay attention to these distinctions that governments are making between refugee groups. And the UN needs to really target those refugee groups that are going to be treated most poorly. Another implication is that concerned states in the international community really need to recognize that there are going to be some cases where their pressure is not going to bear fruit, and that they must rely on other tools like resettlement with regards to those refugees who are going to be treated most restrictively by the governments that are hosting them.
Oh, great. I mean, those are really, in some ways, quite radical policy shifts, at least in terms of rhetoric, or an organization that speaks in terms of, human rights and global commitments to all refugees. And I can imagine it would be a very difficult rhetorical shift to make. The other thing I think that was striking in this account of UNHCR, and our colleague, Dr. Caroline Nalule, who wasn't able to join us, was really intrigued at this, was the picture of UNHCR as, an entity to which states can comfortably delegate because the host state stays in control. And of course, the other side of that coin might be to say, well, but UNHCR controls a lot of aid and other financial support. But your account seems to suggest that really they're quite supine, and I wondered if that's a fair reading of your book, and should they be? I mean, do you think they really are subject to such an amount of pressure from host states?
I do think that UNHCR comes under a lot of pressure, and to a large degree, I don't know. I do think that in many cases UNHCR is genuinely doing the best that it can, given the circumstances, right? But I do find in some of the research for my book, I do find that governments exert a lot of pressure on UNHCR. They exert pressure on UNHCR to resettle refugees. They exert pressure on UNHCR to bring in international funds. They exert pressure on UNHCR if it criticizes government policy. In some cases, we know that governments have stationed police officers outside UNHCR offices to make sure that asylum seekers don't have access to UNHCR in order to file their applications. So I do find that UNHCR does come under a lot of pressure, and we know that UNHCR is, I think, rightfully concerned about its ability to continue operating on countries' territories, and it knows that if it maybe criticizes that government too stringently, that it could be kicked out of the country. And I think that UNHCR staff genuinely worry about the protection space. I do wonder, though, whether maybe UNHCR is a little too timid. I did see in my research that there was at least one instance where UNHCR officials in Turkey were talking about, in internal memos that I found in the UNHCR archives, were talking about the fact that they've stopped using the words refugee and mandate when they speak with the Turkish government. And I found this really striking. The UN Refugee Agency would stop using the word refugee. And they said that the memo says that they stopped using these words because it had, quote, provoked a negative response on the part of the Turkish government. So I would like to see UNHCR maybe not be quite so timid. I think if it gets to the point where you're unable to utter the word refugee, then maybe it's gone a little bit too far.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ed, for sharing that that example from the archives. But I think this may prompt some self-reflection in UNHCR, because I think you're right, the threat from the host state is often ubiquitous. And in some cases, they will perform it very vividly. I mean, right now, again, we're at a moment where Kenya is threatening to close the largest refugee camps in the world. And whether this is political theater or a real threat, it's unclear. But I think a period of internal reflection about these dynamics and how they can be better managed might be prompted by your book, which would be a real policy impact, I think, for it. I'm really conscious we could talk about this book for hours, but that isn't going to be helpful for other people who want to hear about it. I think we've conveyed how rich it is in terms of political science methods, qualitative and quantitative. What we maybe didn't mention is that it's a great read. I mean, it's actually a very easy read. I read it, I think, very quickly, like one of those unputdownable moments. And I don't say that about academic books very often. So we really are giving it a warm recommendation to other scholars. And in terms of its contribution to refugee studies, I think it's really remarkable. So I hope you get lots of kudos, and at an appropriate moment, we can sort of toast it properly at a social event as well. I don't know, Derya, if you have any final questions. Yeah. I have one fun question that I wanted to wrap up with, and that was to ask you about the playlist on your academic website. This is a first. I don't know any other scholars who also have musical playlists. So I don't know if you want to tell us about that.
I'm happy to. So I a long time ago, my first job was at the University of California in Santa Cruz, and I was thrown into a lecture hall to teach international relations theory to, I think, 200 undergraduates. And I found that it was very difficult to get them to quiet down at the beginning of the session. And so I hit on the idea of playing music at the beginning of each session, picking a song that would be very relevant to that day's session. And then at the end of the song, the students would kind of naturally calm down and naturally sort of start paying attention to me speaking. And then I would share the playlist at the end of this semester. Students were studying for their final exams, and they would sort of listen to it as they were studying, and they reported back that it helped them remember what the different topics were that we were discussing. This previous fall, in light of the pandemic, I was trying to figure out ways to draw students in and keep them engaged in an online format. And I remembered that I had done this previously, so I created playlists for two of my courses, a course on human rights and a course on refugees. And I have to say that creating the playlists itself was probably the most fun I've had recently in terms of teaching and instruction, because it gave me an opportunity to explore music that's out there that's created by refugees, music that speaks to the themes of refugees. And so I tried to create a playlist that covers a wide range of genres, but that's still very relevant to the specific topics that we're discussing in each session.
Great. Gosh, that's a wonderful answer. I wasn't expecting it to be. So I have a great vision of like sort of rock star style professor who plays music to have her own intro.
I do need to work on my entrances. I think I could enter in a much more flamboyant way.
Okay, that's great. Well, look, thank you again so much for speaking to us. It's a great privilege to discuss the book with you in this way. And we hope it helps in some small way to get other readers for it as well. Yeah. Great.
Thank you so much for your fantastic questions. I enjoyed speaking with you.
Great. Thank you, Derya, too. And bye, everyone. Thank you.